Welcome to Dalma Makes. In this video, I'll share the process of transforming a wooden blank of a lantern into a fairy's workshop. This is a miniature project and it has more steps than my smaller projects and definitely took longer to make. So settle in, make yourself cozy, and let me take you along on one of my longer crafty adventures. I got this wooden blank from a craft shop. I knew I wanted to preserve some of its illuminating essence, so I will be using LEDs in this project to light it up. I envisioned this as an outdoor gazebo type thing, so my first job was some structural work, as I wanted to make a sort of pyramid roof for this. I made a paper mock-up just so I can figure out the size, and I cut out some triangles from some foam board. Foam board is just some expanded polystyrene between two sheets of paper. It is lightweight but rigid and easy to cut. Once I've had my triangles cut out, I tested to see if it would work, and I realized I needed to bevel the edges on the inside so that the triangles could neatly fit together. And I just freehanded this with a fresh sharp blade. The inside wasn't going to show and functionality mattered more to me. I just used some tape to temporarily hold the pieces together, and I used some paper masking tape on the outside just to hide the seams and to preempt some gaping problems in the future. And to permanently glue them together, I just used some hot glue. Don't worry, what you see coming off is steam, not smoke. Another structural change I wanted to make was to enclose 2 out of the 4 walls so that I have some surfaces inside. And I measured and cut out 2 more pieces of foam board for that. Before I added anything on, though, I made sure to base coat all the wooden surfaces with a nice warm chocolate brown, as accessing any of the beams was going to become a lot harder once structural changes will be made. While the acrylic paint is drying, I turned my attention to my wall pieces. I wanted the exterior to have a nice brick texture. For that, I used a stencil and some texture paste, and I used a spatula to spread a thin layer evenly through the stencil. The second piece was a little bit wider, so I had to reposition my stencil at one point to cover the entire surface, and this gave me a little bit of irregularity and a little bit of gap in the middle that I welcomed. While that texture paste dries, I started working on the roof. I wanted to have some kind of whimsical, pretty tiles on the roof. And looking through my materials, I found this really nice scalloped edge, kind of machine lace fabric pieces. I thought they would work perfectly, but as it's flimsy fabric, I needed to attach it to something a lot sturdier. So to do that, I just used some cardstock from packaging material, and I glued it on with some gel matte medium. I know at this stage it looks like absolute madness and ugly, but nothing really matters. I just need a solid backing, as all of these pieces are going to be cut out and carefully painted later. The gel matte medium also needed quite a few hours to dry. So on to the next structural thing I needed, the floor. I used some scrap paper to fit measure and cut out a template for exactly the size and shape of the interior floor, as those beams cut into the square that would be the floor. And then using the template, I cut out another foam core piece for the flooring. I had to carefully cut out the corners to accommodate those beams. I thought some textured tiling would make the perfect floor for this little gazebo workshop. In my stash, I already had a piece of cardstock that had some tiles stenciled on with texture paste, and I just glued a piece of it on, making sure to apply generous amounts of PVA glue to make really good contact, and then I also left that to dry. The gel matte medium dried completely, and I was able to carefully cut out the scalloped edge of all of these little pieces, and now they have become sturdier, easier to manipulate strips of cardboard with the beautiful scalloped embroidered texture on it. Each side of the roof is going to have 3 tiers stacked on top of each other. Before gluing them on though, I decided to paint them first, as it might be harder to get full coverage once they're glued on. I chose a nice bright red for the base color, and I'm going to thoroughly paint each strip, making that ugly background go away. I'm not quite sure why, but this particular red was blowing out my camera a little bit. It looks neon, but it's not like that in real life. I think in the end I gave each piece 2 coats of this red. All that acrylic paint also needed a bit of time to dry, so I returned my attention to the floor piece, which I once again carefully cut out the notches for the corners and cut off all the excess. For the color of the floor, I wanted a sort of dark teal going towards blue, so I mixed my own color for this. And I think I added a couple of coats of this color to the floor, drying in between until I reached opacity. Meanwhile, of course, my brick walls have also dried, and I mixed a warm cream color for a base coat, as I actually wanted this to be the color for the grout between the bricks. Also, just having a coat of acrylic makes it easier to add the final colors on the bricks themselves. When I'm working on something like this with many different parts, I cycle through jobs, waiting for some things to dry and being actively able to work on other parts. So I've returned to the floor tile, and with a nice robin's egg blue, I used my finger to gently rub across the surface and bring back that beautiful tile texture, but this time in the desired color. To raise the floor a little bit so it's not so sunken in, I just used whatever scraps of foamcore I had and then glued in the floor itself. With those roof tile pieces dry, I decided to assemble them, and for an adhesive I'm just going to use hot glue for instant grab. So the idea is to just carefully stack 3 layers of the tiling, overlapping, and then cutting off the excess, and then moving on to do all the other sides as well. With the roof tiles finally in place, I used a couple of shades of orange and yellow to bring back that beautiful scalloped and lacy texture that I was aiming for. I'll never get tired of the magic of using paint this way, just making all those shapes magically reappear. I am left with these ugly seams though, so I've decided to cover these using some paper straws. I'm going to carefully cut these paper straws in half. I just used a sharp blade and a lot of hope in trying to get these cut in half as neatly as I could, and with some trial and error I got 4 usable pieces in the end. I also painted these with the same red I used on the rest of the roof. Now I have neat coverage for those ugly gaping seams. Of course, I'm going to use more paint to touch up any overhang or gaps that I originally missed, and to have the same level of detail on all of the parts. To finish off the roof, of course, I needed something for the very top, and I found this plastic cap in my stash. I don't know what it was from, but I just decided to paint it a little bit gold over the black base that it was, and it was the perfect fit. With that, the structure of my roof is done, but later I'm going to make it even better with some moss. Here's just a sneaky preview of that. Let's return to the walls now. I was quite invested in the brickwork, so I decided to paint the bricks individually using 4 different colors. I just used a smaller brush and lots of patience. I put an audiobook on and just took my time to carefully paint each one. The colors I chose were a warm gray, darker tan, a darker yellow ochre, and an orangish yellow. It's rather satisfying to watch all the bricks come to life one by one. To seal in the paint and add some weathering, I just used some yellow shellac ink straight from the bottle without mixing anything else into it, as I didn't want to darken it too much. They do lighten a little bit as the ink dries. On the interior of the walls, I used this pattern paper to stand in for some vintage wallpaper, and I attached that with some PVA glue. Dirtied up the edges with a little bit of brown ink just to make it a little bit lived in and old. And it's finally time to attach my walls, and I used just some more hot glue for this part of the assembly as well. There were some unfortunate gaps on the edges, so I just filled in those and later repainted all those edges with the same chocolate brown I used for the wooden structure. I also used the same brown to fill in some of the gaps and add a little bit of weathering on the brickwork itself, again making it a little bit more grungy, a little bit more lived in. And in the end, when I add some moss and greenery, this is what it's going to look like. I always meant to make this light up, and conveniently I had a hole in the top, so I'm going to use a string of LED lights with a little battery pack. To install these, I rolled up the LED lights in a coil and I fit them around the top edge around the ceiling. Now that the major structural stuff is dealt with, it's time to work on the miniature furniture. I knew I wanted to add some shelves and some kind of counter with drawers. And to build my own miniature counter, storage and workspace, I'm just using some thicker cardstock and this wooden piece that I think was a lid to something originally, but I'm going to use it as a front of a drawer. I just sketched in, measured and cut out all of the holes I needed for the shelves in the front of this little storage unit that I'm making. I'm just using a sharp blade and a lot of patience to cut all of these things out. And to make everything even neater looking, I'm using just some food skewers to have nice beveled edges on the front. Not gonna lie, it was quite frustrating to cut through those little food skewers. They are a lot more resilient than they look. But I fit measured and sanded down everything so that it fits. For cardstock and wood, my choice of glue is PVA. It's the best for these materials. Before I got too far in the assembly process, I painted all the little bits, base coated them with the same chocolate brown I used on the frame. Some of these are going to be part of the storage unit, some of these are going to be the shelves and the interiors of the drawers. It's just easier to paint things before they are assembled, as it's much harder to get into the finicky little corners later. This way I can turn and access the pieces from all the possible angles, and if I miss anything in the final pass of painting, at least it will only be dark brown in those recesses, not like white or gray or any of the original colors. That would stand out a lot more. After drying, I assembled my furniture, and as you can see, I also have a matching tiny desk with a drawer. I had fun figuring out how to make miniature furniture, as I've never made anything like this before. I'm sure there are better ways to do it, but I just enjoyed figuring it out my way. I did have a little bit of cleanup left, as I had to add some strips of cardboard as reinforcement in the back, but that cleanup wasn't too difficult. To make my furniture look used and old, I added some weathering with some light brown, just lightly brushing over with my fingers, basically catching the edges and anywhere the furniture would have more contact with stuff over the years. I think this brings it to life and makes it look a bit more realistic. Finally, happy with it, I glued in the shelves and this storage unit at the bottom. The desk, however, I'm not going to glue in for now, as it will be easier to assemble it freestanding. I found this cork tag in my stash, and I thought it would make the perfect little cork board for the fairy workshop. But first I'm going to focus on this wall. Of course, I'm going to add some miniature books to those two top shelves. The miniature books are handmade. They're just printed paper wrapped around bits of wood. These do not open, but look really nice with the spines facing outward. Between those books, I decided to add this teeny tiny brass box. Who knows what kind of interesting trinkets the fairy would keep in that. And I filled the rest of the top shelf with the miniature books. For the lower shelf, I added some bottles, trinkets, just a selection that felt right to me, as what would my tiny little fairy keep on display and on hand on these shelves. As you can see, I added some beads, a teeny tiny seashell, and a pine cone, as these would be the things that the tiny fairy would collect, I think. I had this beautiful glass container that I thought would look absolutely adorable to keep sweets in at my little fairy's scale. So I added some microbeads inside. I think these are intended to be used with nail art, and I glued it permanently shut to avoid risking spilling the contents. While leaving that to dry, I'm going to turn my attention to filling up some of those shelves, and I'm going to add a stack of tied together papers to one of the shelves, and an interesting golden bead that kind of looks like a treasure box from the side for another one. The sea glass piece looks so much like an ant egg to me. So I thought, what if the fairy found this abandoned ant egg and it's keeping it warm in a basket, hatching it in her little workshop, keeping an eye on it while she works on her projects. As of course, in this fairies world, ants are like domesticated pets, like puppies. To make a nice comfy little basket for the ant egg, I assembled this lace doily inside of this ring from my stash that I think makes it look like a shallow wicker basket lined with a nice little crochet blanket to keep the egg warm. For the bottom right cubby hole, I added some scrolls. These might be some grand plans and schematics for some of the fairies' bigger projects. I also found this miniature map in my stash and I added it to the back wall for some variation. And one of my absolute favorite pieces, this miniature sewing box with different colored threads, tiny buttons, measuring tape, and other doodads one might keep in a sewing box. This will go right in the center of the counter, joined by this miniature pumpkin and tiny bottle. I also added a book and a little potted plant, as the interests of my tiny fairy are many and varied. I have to admit, this area is my absolute favorite in this whole piece. That sewing box just makes me so happy, and the thought of the little fairy hatching the little ant that's going to become her puppy is just so heartwarming to me. But let's move on to the other wall. I have shown you this corkboard before. It's time to find some miniature images and stickers from my stash that are appropriate at the scale that I'm working with. I think it would be sort of like an inspiration board for my little fairy. Of course, there would be mushrooms and frogs and pumpkins and flowers. I like the idea of her pinning things onto it when she sees something that inspires her. I just glued this corkboard right onto the interior wall under the shelf. Now it's time to add some stuff to the little desk, and the objects I've decided to add are a book, because our fairy loves to read, some blank paper sheets because she loves to write letters. Of course, I weathered the edges of the book a little bit so it's not that stark white. It doesn't really fit with anything else. Just having a little bit of play with the objects, trying to decide what goes where. I also decided to add a miniature glass of wine, a letter opener, and a brayer. I wanted it to look busy and crowded, as if the fairy just stepped away from her work while sipping on a glass of wine. Is a closer look of what that ends up looking like after I placed the desk inside as well. I also felt it was appropriate to add another potted plant, this time a big one. I just used a plastic bead that looked a lot like a plant pot to me. Although I'm going to glue this and the desk in as the very last step. First, I still need to fill in that top shelf I thought our little fairy would use this top shelf to display some of her trophies. What these trophies exactly would be from, I'm not sure, but I picked a faceted, sparkly heart, a cat statue, and a crystal globe. With mostly everything in place, it is time to mossify the whole project. To do that, I used this green scatter material. I believe it's dyed and blended up pieces of sponge. To make it easier for me to apply it to my project, I mixed it with some PVA glue and a little bit of water, sort of making a paste out of it. And using my spatula and my fingers, I added it onto the roof and onto the base piece, all over the place that I felt moss would grow. Also using it to strategically hide any unevenness or any slight mistake or unsightly gap. I also think it just looks wonderful, and any project that I can add some moss to, I will. I think thematically it's also fitting, as I imagine this fairy workshop to be like a standalone gazebo outside in the backyard. Partially covered, sheltered from the elements, but also outside. Although it looks goopy and milky now, this material will dry really well. It won't flake off when handled, and the PVA glue will be transparent. As you can see right now, after overnight drying, I believe. I'm very happy with the moss, but I thought I could take it even a step further by actually using clumps of static grass in different colors and sizes to add more variety to it. Adding greenery to stuff just makes me really happy. And I like the idea of plants sneaking into some of the inside parts of the gazebo as well. I gave the same treatment to the roof, adding those little cute clumps of grass here and there, making it even more aesthetically pleasing. I think the green with the red roof tiles is a beautiful contrast. In the end, I decided I wanted to add something to the interior roof as well. I didn't want to cover the LED lights. I wanted them to shine as brightly as possible, but I added these green silk leaves and a resin rose to the middle to sort of have a ceiling decoration as well. I secured the battery pack with a glue dot, nothing too permanent because I do want to be able to change out the battery when it's gone. This piece is going to function as a nightlight quite well, I think. And there it is, my fairy workshop is finally finished. Thank you for coming on this adventure with me. Which one is your favorite part of this project? Which element grabbed your eye the most? Was it a particular miniature? Was it the textured floor or the roof? Please do let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts, and feedback always helps me. If you enjoyed this project, please don't forget to do all the YouTube things, press the like button, and consider subscribing to my channels. I post crafty videos every week. I'll leave you to enjoy the glamour shots with some music. Thank you for watching. I hope you're having a nice day. Bye.